This is Conversations in Civics. I'm Dr. Terri Fine. Joining me for this conversation is Naze Sahebzamani. Naze, tell us a little bit about your school and what you teach.
I teach at Robinson High School in the International Baccalaureate program, and I teach 9th graders American government.
Great. Today we're going to talk about our current political parties and the ideas that different parties have about government. Naze, I'm certain that you have lots of questions for me, so what's your first one?
First one's very basic. Can you tell me the difference between Republicans and Democrats?
I think that's a great question to start with because in many ways the name Democrat and Republican sound very similar. Democrat meaning rule by the people, Republican meaning representative, or the idea that the people are represented in their government by their elected officials. So both of them sort of speak to this notion of rule by the people. So what's important to talk about when we're talking about Republicans and Democrats is that both parties are doing their best to reflect the will of the people. And the names that the people associate with American government are representative or Republican and democratic or democracy. Those names were taken on in many ways to try to capture the public. But the way that the issues have changed over the last 200 plus years, that means that the political parties themselves have changed their positions on the issues as well. So when we say, for example, that something's a Democratic perspective or a Republican perspective, we have to put that in context because the context needs to be placed in terms of, is this the 1960s or the 1860s? Is it the turn of the 20th century or the turn of the 21st century? Because if I were to tell you things about, for example, Teddy Roosevelt, and I would say, oh, you know, he was a trust buster and he was a very strong consumer advocate and he was very much concerned about laborers and how workers were treated, you might say, well, he must have been a Democratic president, yet he was Republican. If I were to talk to you about some Democratic members of Congress from the 1950s and how they worked very, very hard to prevent the Civil Rights Act from ever being passed in the 50s and then in the 60s, you would think, wait a second, I thought that Republicans were more about states' rights and that Republicans might be more about working against sort of this nationalism of civil rights. So we really have to look at the people involved and the times in which they're working when we're talking about differences between Republicans and Democrats, because we're really talking about different ideas of different people.
So how would you define the two parties today?
Oh, I would look at the two parties today as being that, particularly since, I would say probably since the 1960s, maybe the 1980s, depending on if you're going to look at Barry Goldwater or Ronald Reagan, that when we're talking about conservatism, we're talking about the Republican Party is presenting itself these days as being more conservative, meaning that it's looking for less government intervention, looking for more states' rights, more emphasis on giving the states the sovereignty and the freedom and the autonomy to do what it is that they believe that they need to do for the people, and also to encourage opportunities for individuals in their private lives to do well economically, etc. So that's sort of how they paint themselves today. And the reason why I mentioned Goldwater and Reagan is that, did you know that Ronald Reagan was a Democrat until Barry Goldwater inspired him? You didn't know that. That Ronald Reagan in 1960, he headed the organization called Democrats for Nixon. Right? He was a very well-known movie star at the time, and then when Barry Goldwater ran in 1964, and Barry Goldwater was a Republican, he changed to be a Republican. So in many ways, Ronald Reagan is a Republican because of Barry Goldwater. That's why I mentioned, say, well, did it really start in the 60s or the 80s? But sort of that notion, that element of conservatism that we see sort of started with Goldwater, but really took shape, many people say, with Reagan. Talking about Democrats today, Democrats present themselves as arguing that there are certain privileges, rights, and opportunities that people should have no matter what state that they live in, and therefore there should be the nationalization of many policies, the nationalization of certain rights. And so what you'll find is that the Republican Party, for example, looking at equal rights for women, just as an example, that the Republican Party is not against equal rights for women, but they have taken a position at the national level they're against the Equal Rights Amendment being added to the national Constitution. The Democrats, on the other hand, say the only way that we can guarantee equal rights for women nationally is through this Equal Rights Amendment added to the Constitution. So we do see that a lot of the same values and a lot of the same policy concerns, but the issue is how they both choose to respond to them, and that's where we look at differences and find them between the two political parties.
I heard earlier you mentioned about being conservative.
Mm-hmm.
So can you explain the difference between conservatism and liberalism and how it applies to the Republican and Democratic parties?
That's a really great question, because when we look at conservative, we look at the idea that someone is resistant to change. And so we often associate conservatives with either the status quo, keeping things as they are, or perhaps being resistant to changes that have been recently made and being opposed to recent changes. Liberal, just like the word suggests, would mean orient towards change. Mm-hmm. And there's an interesting phrase that sort of is bandied about among, I'm sure, very boring people that says, today's conservatives were yesterday's liberals, right? That today's conservatives, because they got the change they wanted, they want to keep things as they are, but they had to be liberals in order to get change in the first place. So we look at conservatives and liberals today that really the Democratic Party has taken on either as self-identity or as an identification from other political parties and interest groups as being the liberal party, the one that wants more national policy, more change, saying that we haven't done enough to help certain groups, we need to do more in order to bring about better business practices, or whatever the case may be, while the Republican Party is saying we are not oriented towards change, because if we take more policies and put them in place, then that will reduce the freedoms that people have, and we don't want to reduce freedom. So as I said, both political parties are looking at themselves as saying, well, we all want freedom, we all want equality, we all want justice, but it's how you get there. And so the conservative ideology is more closely aligned with the Republican Party in the early 21st century, mm-hmm. and then the Democratic Party is more aligned with the liberal perspective.
Great. Yeah. I think it's also important because a lot of my kids like to know how income, education, age affects how people vote, and why someone in their early 20s are going to vote differently than they do in their 40s or their 60s. Can you explain how education, age can affect voters?
Naze, there's a phrase that says, where you stand depends upon where you sit. And that is the best way to answer your question, that your experience, right? Your experience shapes the way you view the political process. Let's look at it from an economic perspective. From an economic perspective, just to be here today, we had to be consumers. We had to buy items so that we could eat. We had to buy items so that we could clothe ourselves. We had to pay rent or pay a mortgage so we'd have housing, or whatever the case may be. We had to buy transportation. So being a consumer is a daily experience. Being a person who's engaged in politics, unfortunately, is seen by far too many people as being something that we do once every 4 years. We vote once every 4 years and that's it. Therefore, people take their daily experience, right? I cannot change my age. I have the education I have, and as a consequence, I have the job that I have as a result of that education. So those are my daily experiences, my job, my age, that's it. So I see the political world through those lenses. So as those lenses change, so too will my view of this political process that people engage with far less frequently than they do other parts of their life, which are daily aspects of their life. So what have we seen? What differences have we seen? Well, some scholars say that as education increases, one is more likely to become more liberal. However, other studies on college campuses have found, well, if you look at different majors, if you look at business schools, you'll find more Republicans in business schools than in the humanities and the English department, where you find more Democrats. We find that as people age, that they tend to have different experiences, right? People who have never voted before will often vote for the first time after the birth of their first child. And they say, well, what you think somebody would be awfully busy after the birth of their first child, when in fact, particularly among women, when in fact it's really that people are starting to think ahead 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. Where's my child going to go to school? Am I living in a good district? Should I get involved with the local school board in terms of what kinds of policies do they have in terms of curriculum? What kinds of ideas do they have about what they're going to be teaching my child? So people, in starting to see their day-to-day lives connect with the political process, they'll get involved and they'll start to see it differently because it's a new experience for them. Some people say that as people age, they become more conservative, when in reality, what's happening is that people who were more likely to identify themselves as Democrats, and a lot of people, large percentage of people identified as Democrats during the Great Depression and World War II. Well, as those folks age out and become less participatory for health reasons, or they pass away, they're then replaced by sort of this cyclical process, whereas we have a growth in liberalism tends to be responded to with a growth in conservatism and so forth. So it's not that as people age, they necessarily change their party ID. It's more something that we call generational replacement, that as one group sort of ages out of the political process, another group sort of moves in that had a different set of experiences. So age and education and income, as those experiences change, then a person's political views will change. Income has the effect where as people's income grows, they do tend to become more conservative. And the reason for that, people explain, is because the tax policies are such, income tax and so forth, the things that they want to buy, those things are going to be higher, right? You're in a higher income tax bracket as you make more money. You're not in a higher income tax bracket as you make less money. And so people then start to sort of look at the political process a bit differently. You know, Naze, I think we've got time for just one or two more questions. So what's on your agenda today?
Well, we've talked about how people change their voting habits as they change in their life and as they grow. Can you tell me how the parties change the way they approach voters according to their age or their income?
Oh, absolutely. You know, the political parties are only as relevant, okay, as their last election, right? I remember when I was in college, you know, I took French in 8th grade and I forgot most of it, but I remembered in college, raison d'être, reason for being, right? You have to have a reason for being. If you stop being relevant, then you're not going to win as many elections, you're not going to raise money, etc. So what the political parties have found themselves doing is targeting high turnout groups to try to get them to vote, not only vote, but to vote for them, right? Because if it's a high turnout group, those are people who are very civically minded, they're going to vote anyway. And so the key is the parties are trying to shape their messages in a way to get high turnout groups to vote for them, and also in order to sort of pass that 50-yard line, to win that election, where you just need a vote to do it, right? 1+, right? Majority vote. Then consequently, the political parties are going to try to get perhaps people who have a spottier voting history and to try to sort of focus on those voters. And consequently, the messages are going to be different. So for example, you might have high turnout voters who are getting their political information from newspapers, and they're going to be responding to that information. But if you have people with a spottier voting history and they might be more likely to watch television, then those messages are going to go on television. So in order for the parties to maintain their raison d'être, their reason for being, then what they're going to do is they're going to then target different populations, and what they're also going to do is they're going to target their populations with different types of messages using different media. You know, Naze, I've enjoyed our conversation so much today, and unfortunately our time has come to an end.
Well, thank you for answering my questions.
We've been talking about our current political parties and how their ideas about government differ. And that's Conversations in Civics. I'm Dr. Terri Susan Fine.